color of invisibility was a pale, watery gray. It was the color of my dress, the color of the wall I was pressed against, the color of the very air around me, thick with conversations that never included my name. My stepmother, Lady Beatrice, had a particular genius for this kind of cruelty. It was never a loud, theatrical banishment that might draw unwanted sympathy. It was a quiet, surgical excision performed with a smile. Tonight, at the annual Hartwell Gala, her scalpel was particularly sharp. "Eleonora, dear," she had said, her voice like honey laced with ground glass, "the main tables are so frightfully crowded, you wouldn't be comfortable. We've found a much quieter spot for you. You do so prefer the quiet, don't you?" The quieter spot was a small, round table tucked into an alcove near the kitchens, a place meant for the hired musicians during their break, or perhaps a lady's companion who had been forgotten. It was a table for the superfluous, for the invisible. My sister Rosalind, resplendent in silk the color of a summer dawn, had given me a fleeting, pitying look before being swept away by a throng of admirers. My father, a man long since hollowed out by my stepmother's will, had simply avoided my gaze. He had mastered the art of not seeing what was inconvenient. So I sat, a ghost at a feast, watching the vibrant life of the ballroom swirl at a distance. The candlelight turned jewels to fire and laughter to music. Here, in my shadowed corner, the only sounds were the distant clatter of plates and the rhythmic thumping of my own lonely heart. I did not weep. Tears were a luxury I had learned to suppress. They were a sign of wanting something, and wanting was the first step toward a pain I could not bear. It was better to expect nothing, to be nothing, to simply endure the slow, grinding passage of time until I could retreat to the safety of my small room and the silent companionship of my books. A sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, a subtle dip in the crescendo of chatter, snagged my attention. The grand doors had opened, and a man stood silhouetted against the night. Even from this distance, the sheer force of his presence was palpable. It was the Duke of Blackwood. Alaric, a man spoken of in whispers, a figure of immense wealth and power who had been a recluse for years, ever since the tragedy that had claimed his wife and child. He was called the Winter Duke, a man forged from ice and shadow, and his unexpected appearance here sent a ripple of shock and speculation through the glittering assembly. He was not handsome in the conventional, charming way of the young lords who flocked around my sister. His features were stark, carved from granite, and his eyes, even from across the room, seemed to miss nothing. He moved with a kind of predatory grace, ignoring the fawning hosts and the hopeful gazes of ambitious mothers. He surveyed the room not as a guest, but as a king surveying his domain. His gaze swept over the crowded tables, over the dancing couples, over the preening peacocks of the tun, and then, impossibly, it stopped. It stopped on me. For a paralyzing moment, I was certain I was mistaken. He must be looking at the tapestry behind me, or perhaps the floral arrangement wilting in the corner. But his focus was unwavering. It was direct, intense, and utterly unreadable. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. He was seeing me in my exile, my humiliation laid bare for the most powerful man in the room to witness. I dropped my eyes to my lap, my hands clenched together, praying for the floor to swallow me whole. I wanted to shrink, to dissolve, to become the watery gray of my dress until I was nothing but a smudge of paint on the wall. The silence around me deepened. I risked a glance upward. He was moving. Not toward the head table where a seat was hastily being prepared for him, not toward the host or the evening's most celebrated beauties, but in a direct, unswerving line toward my corner, toward my table, toward me. A wave of panic crashed over me. What had I done? Was my very presence in his line of sight an offense? My stepmother's face, visible over the shoulder of a portly baron, was a mask of horrified confusion. This was not part of her carefully orchestrated evening. This was an aberration, a disruption of the social order she so meticulously curated. He arrived. He did not speak. He simply stood before my small, insignificant table, a towering figure of black wool and stark authority. The entire ballroom seemed to be holding its breath. He looked at the single lonely place setting, then at me. His expression was still, a frozen landscape I could not hope to interpret. Then he turned, and with a quiet, deliberate gesture, he signaled to a footman. "Bring my chair," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a blade through silk. It was a low, resonant baritone that carried with it the weight of absolute command. The footman, wide-eyed and trembling slightly, scurried to the head table, retrieved the ornate high-backed chair intended for the guest of honor, and carried it across the marble floor. Every eye followed its journey. Lady Beatrice looked as if she might faint. The Duke waited, his posture relaxed but radiating an unassailable power. The footman placed the chair beside my own simple one at the small, forgotten table. It looked absurdly grand, a throne next to a stool. The Duke of Blackwood inclined his head to me, a gesture of profound, almost courtly respect. "I find the crush of the crowd rather tiresome," he stated, his voice for my ears alone, though the sentiment seemed to echo through the stunned silence of the room. "I hope you do not mind if I join you. You seem to have found the most sensible seat in the house." And then, as the collective society of the county watched in utter disbelief, the Winter Duke, the most powerful and reclusive man in the kingdom, sat down beside me at the servants' table. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of my world breaking apart. The carriage ride home was a silent torment. The air was thick with my stepmother's fury, a palpable, vibrating thing that was far more terrifying than any shouted recrimination. She sat opposite me, her fan tapping a frantic, venomous rhythm against her palm. Rosalind stared out the window, a frown creasing her perfect brow, while my father seemed to have shrunk into the corner, a study in pathetic irrelevance. I was the source of this storm, the unexploded bomb in the center of their lives. When we arrived, Beatrice dismissed the servants with a flick of her wrist. The moment the front door was closed, her control shattered. "What did you do?" she hissed, her face pale and pinched. "What game were you playing, you conniving little wren?" "I did nothing," I whispered, the words sticking in my throat. "I was sitting where you told me to sit." "Do not play the fool with me," she snapped. "The Duke of Blackwood does not simply decide to sit with a non-entity by chance. You must have done something to draw his attention, some pathetic, simpering plea for pity." "I never spoke to him," I insisted, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I never even looked at him until he was walking toward me." "She's telling the truth, Mother," Rosalind said quietly, surprising me. I was watching. He saw her from the doorway and walked straight to her. It was most peculiar. Beatrice rounded on her own daughter. Peculiar? It was a disaster. It was a public spectacle. He made a mockery of us, of this family, by elevating her. The contempt with which she said the word was a physical blow. "All my work, all my planning to secure you a good match, and it is all overshadowed by this absurdity." She turned back to me, her eyes glittering with malice. "Whatever you think you have gained tonight, girl, I assure you it is nothing. He was toying with you, a powerful man's whim. By tomorrow, he will have forgotten your name. But I will not." The threat hung in the air as I fled to my room. I did not believe her, not entirely. The Duke had not seemed like a man given to whims. There was an unnerving purpose in his actions, but what purpose could possibly involve me? I was plain. I was quiet. My only dowry was a collection of well-read books, and a mind my stepmother had always called inconveniently cluttered. I was nothing, and men like the Duke of Blackwood did not concern themselves with nothing. I spent the next day in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I expected a summons from my stepmother for some new punishment, or perhaps a note of mocking dismissal from the Duke's estate. Nothing came. The silence was its own form of torture. By the third day, I'd convinced myself that Beatrice was right. It had been a fleeting moment of madness, a bizarre dream that had no bearing on my real life. Then the letter arrived. It was not a flimsy social note, but a heavy cream card sealed with the formidable black wax of the Blackwood crest. It was addressed shockingly to me, Miss Eleonora Ashworth. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. My stepmother stood over me, her breath hot on my neck, her impatience a radiating heat. The note was brief, its script as stark and elegant as the man who had written it. "Miss Ashworth, I find myself in possession of a first edition of Tacitus's Annals that may be of interest to you. I would be honored if you would call upon Blackwood Manor tomorrow at 2 o'clock to view it. A carriage will be sent." Blackwood. Beatrice snatched it from my hands. Her eyes scanned the few lines, her expression shifting from suspicion to disbelief, and then to a cold, calculating fury. Tacitus, a dusty Roman historian. This was not the language of courtship. It was something stranger, something she could not comprehend, and therefore, something she could not control. "This is absurd," she finally declared, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "A pretext. He is amusing himself. But you will go, and you will be on your very best behavior. You will not bore him with your opinions on history. You will be demure and agreeable. Do you understand me, Eleonora? This is an opportunity for the family, and you will not ruin it." The Blackwood carriage arrived precisely at 1:45 the next day. It was a magnificent, somber vehicle, pulled by two perfectly matched black horses. As I stepped inside, I felt as though I were being ferried to another world. The manor itself was more fortress than home, a great pile of granite that seemed to rise from the earth, stern and imposing against the gray sky. It was a reflection of its master. I was led not to a frivolous drawing room, but to a library that stole my breath away. It was a cathedral of books, 2 stories high, with soaring shelves that disappeared into the shadows above. A rolling ladder leaned against one wall, and the air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. And there, standing by a massive fireplace where a low fire crackled, was the Duke. He was dressed simply, without the formal trappings of the gala, but he seemed no less formidable. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice the same low rumble I remembered. "Thank you for coming." "Your Grace," I managed, curtsying. "The honor is mine." He gestured to a chair near the fire, but did not immediately sit himself. He watched me, his gaze as intense and searching as it had been in the ballroom. I felt like a page in a book he was scanning for meaning. The silence stretched, and I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to apologize for my own existence. "I imagine," he began, his tone even, "that you are wondering about my actions the other night." I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. It was not a whim," he said, as if reading my deepest fear. "Nor was it an act of pity." He moved to a small table and picked up a slender, leather-bound volume. "It was an act of recognition." He paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. 5 years ago, I attended a lecture at the Royal Antiquarian Society with your father. It was a dreadfully dull affair concerning the engineering of Roman aqueducts. The lecturer was pompous, the audience was half asleep. At the end, he asked for questions. A young woman near the back in a simple gray dress asked a single question, not about the dates or the names, but about the social implications of diverting water resources, and whether the aqua appia could be seen as the first true instrument of state-sponsored social stratification in an urban environment. My breath hitched. I remembered that day. It was one of the last times my father had taken me anywhere of an intellectual nature, before Beatrice had put a stop to it, declaring it unseemly for a young lady. I had been terrified to speak, but the question had burned in my mind. The lecturer was flummoxed, the Duke continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He had no answer, but I remembered the question, and I remembered the face of the young woman who asked it. He looked directly at me. "It has been 5 years, Miss Ashworth. I saw you across that ballroom, relegated to a corner, and I recognized you. I saw the same intelligence being deliberately hidden, deliberately scorned. I did not move my chair to make a spectacle. I moved it because it was the only seat in the room where an interesting conversation might be had." Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sharp. Not tears of sadness, but of something else, something I couldn't name. It was the shock of being seen, not as a plain face or a social burden or a quiet mouse in a corner, but as a mind, as a person. After a lifetime of being treated as a feature of the background, like a piece of furniture, this man had looked at me and remembered a question I had asked 5 years ago. "Here," he said softly, holding out the book. It was the Tacitus. "I thought you might appreciate it." I took it from him, my fingers brushing his. A jolt, like static on a winter's day, passed between us. I opened the cover. The pages were crisp, the ink dark and clear. It was beautiful. But it was not the book that was the gift. The gift was his reason for giving it. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. No one has ever noticed that part of me before." "Then the Duke of Blackwood said, his eyes holding mine, "are fools." The visits to Blackwood Manor became a quiet ritual, a lifeline in the suffocating sea of my home life. Beatrice allowed them, her face a mask of sour disapproval. She could not comprehend the nature of our meetings, and the mystery gnawed at her. There were no whispered sweet nothings, no strolls in the garden, none of the typical markers of courtship. Instead, there were hours spent in the library, a crackling fire warding off the autumn chill, the scent of old books a comforting balm. We spoke of everything and nothing. We debated the merits of Stoic philosophy versus Epicureanism. He showed me architectural plans for a new wing of the manor and listened, truly listened, to my suggestions about the placement of windows to maximize the morning light. I learned that his severe exterior was a fortress built around a core of profound grief. He rarely spoke of his late wife and daughter, but their absence was a constant, silent presence in the house. It was in the portraits veiled in black crape, in the stillness of the east wing, in the deep, abiding sadness that sometimes surfaced in his eyes when he thought I was not looking. One afternoon, as a cold rain lashed against the tall library windows, he spoke of them. "Her name was Annalise," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "She was like sunlight. And our daughter, Clara, she had her mother's laugh." He fell silent for a long moment. The carriage overturned on the old bridge by Miller's Creek. They said it was instant. I was away in London. I never had the chance to say goodbye. He did not look at me as he spoke, and I knew this was not a plea for sympathy, but a sharing of a burden, a quiet admission of the wound he carried. I did not offer platitudes or empty comforts. I simply sat with him in the quiet grief, my presence a testament that he was not entirely alone in his shadowed world. In that shared silence, a bond was forged that was stronger than any spoken promise. He, in turn, seemed to understand the prison of my own life without my ever having to detail its daily cruelties. He never criticized my family directly, but his kindnesses were a constant, gentle rebellion against their neglect. He would notice a frayed cuff on my dress, and a new bolt of fine wool would be delivered to our house the next day, marked for me. He learned of my love for a particular blend of tea, and a crate of it would arrive from London. Small things, practical things, but each one was a message. "I see you. You are not forgotten." Beatrice grew more and more agitated. This quiet intellectual courtship was beyond her understanding. It offered no gossip, no grand romantic gestures she could boast of. It was an impenetrable fortress of two minds meeting, and she was locked outside. She began to see me not just as an inconvenience, but as a direct threat. Rosalind was still unmarried, and the Duke's continued, focused attention on me was becoming a social oddity, an obstacle to Beatrice's ambitions for her own daughter. The breaking point came one evening. I was descending the stairs for dinner when I overheard her speaking to my father in the study, her voice a venomous whisper. "Cannot continue, Arthur. He is making a fool of us all. People are talking. Why would he choose that plain, sullen girl when Rosalind is right there? There is something wrong with her, I tell you, something unnatural. I will not have it." "What can we do, my dear?" my father's weary voice replied. "He is the Duke of Blackwood. We cannot simply forbid her to see him." "We don't have to," Beatrice purred, and the change in her tone sent a chill down my spine. Men like the Duke value their reputation, their good name above all else. They cannot afford to be associated with scandal or with instability. I crept closer, my heart pounding against my ribs. "I have been speaking with Dr. Finch," she continued. "I told him of Eleonora's moods, her solitary habits, her fancies. He was most sympathetic. A few carefully worded letters, a suggestion of a nervous affliction, a hereditary weakness of the mind from her mother's side. The Duke is a man still mourning a great loss. The last thing he would wish for is to align himself with a damaged, melancholic creature. He will withdraw quietly, and then the way will be clear for Rosalind." I recoiled from the door as if burned. A weakness of the mind. She was going to paint me as mad. It was a lie so monstrous, so diabolical, that it left me breathless. She would use my quiet nature, my love of solitude and books, the very things the Duke admired, and twist them into symptoms of insanity. She was not just trying to end my friendship with the Duke, she was trying to destroy me, to lock me away in a prison of lies from which I could never escape. Terror, cold and absolute, seized me. This was a battle I could not win. Beatrice was a master of social manipulation. I was a novice. My word against hers would be meaningless. The Duke, for all his perception, was still a man of his class. The hint of scandal, of mental fragility, would be a poison he could not ignore. He would retreat as she predicted, and I would be left utterly, finally, alone. That night, I did not sleep. I sat by my window, watching the moon traverse the sky, feeling the walls of my life closing in. Hope was a fragile, tender thing, and Beatrice had just taken a cudgel to it. For the first time, I wept. I wept for the kindness I had been shown, for the brief, beautiful glimpse of a life where I was seen and valued, and for the certainty that it was all about to be snatched away. The Duke's summons arrived 2 days later. My blood ran cold when I saw the Blackwood seal. This was it. The letter Beatrice had written had done its work. The note was formal, requesting the presence of myself, my father, Lord Ashworth, and Lady Beatrice at the manor that afternoon. My stepmother's expression was one of triumphant vindication. She believed she had won. As we were shown into the Duke's grand drawing room, a room I had never entered before, I saw that we were not the only ones present. A stern-looking man with a portfolio of papers sat in one corner. I recognized him as Mr. Davies, the Duke's solicitor. My heart sank. This was to be a formal legal severance. The Duke stood by the mantelpiece, his face as impassive as stone. He did not greet us with his usual quiet warmth. He simply watched us enter, his eyes missing nothing. Beatrice arranged herself on a settee, adopting an expression of concerned sorrow. My father wrung his hands, looking miserable. I stood by the door, feeling like a prisoner awaiting sentencing. Thank you for coming," the Duke began, his voice devoid of all emotion. "I have asked you here to discuss a matter of some delicacy." He paused, his gaze resting on Beatrice. "I received a letter 2 days ago, an anonymous letter, though the hand is remarkably familiar." Beatrice stiffened, her mask of concern faltering for a fraction of a second. "This letter," the Duke continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "made some very serious allegations concerning Miss Ashworth. It spoke of a nervous affliction, of melancholic episodes, and a hereditary fragility of the mind. It suggested, for my own protection, that I sever all ties." He looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw not coldness but a flicker of something else, a deep, simmering anger. "It was a very persuasive letter," he said softly. "It might have worked, had its author not made one fatal error." He turned his gaze back to my stepmother. "They underestimated me. They assumed I was a fool who would be swayed by gossip and innuendo. They forgot that I am a man who prefers facts." He gestured to the solicitor. "Mr. Davies." Mr. Davies stood and opened his portfolio. "Your Grace," he began, his voice dry as dust, "acting upon your instructions, I began a review of certain financial matters pertaining to the Ashworth estate, specifically the trust left to Miss Eleonora Ashworth by her late mother, the first Lady Ashworth." My father blanched. Beatrice's face went chalk white. "Theater." "The trust was modest, but not insignificant," the solicitor continued, consulting his papers. "It was to be managed by Lord Ashworth and his new wife, Lady Beatrice, until Miss Ashworth's marriage or her 25th birthday. For the past 10 years, funds have been systematically diverted from this trust. Funds used for, among other things, dressmakers' bills for Miss Rosalind Ashworth, gambling debts incurred by Lord Ashworth, and investments in a series of failed ventures under Lady Beatrice's name." He looked up, his gaze sharp. "In short, the trust has been almost entirely embezzled. The letter was not an act of concern. It was an act of desperation, an attempt to prevent a marriage that would bring Miss Ashworth's finances under the scrutiny of a new husband." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a strangled gasp from Beatrice. The elaborate tapestry of her lies had just been ripped from the wall, exposing the rot and decay behind it. "You," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You told him. You twisted him against me." And then, something inside me broke. Not with a crash, but with a quiet, clean snap. The fear I had lived with my entire life, the habit of silence and submission, fell away. I looked at the woman who had made my life a living hell, who had tried to steal not just my inheritance, but my very sanity, and I felt nothing but a vast, cold clarity. I took a step forward. My voice, when it came, was steady and clear. It was a voice she had never heard from me before. "No," I said. "I told him nothing. You did this to yourself. For years you have told me I was nothing, a burden, a shadow. You tried to make me invisible, and when that failed, you tried to make me mad. You were so consumed by your own ambition, by your greed and your jealousy, that you never once stopped to consider that I might simply be a person. You saw a problem to be managed, not a daughter to be loved." I turned to my father, who could not meet my eyes. "And you," I said, my voice softening with a sorrow that was deeper than anger. "You stood by and let it happen. You traded my happiness for your quiet life. I hope it was worth it." Finally, I looked at Rosalind, who was staring at her mother with dawning horror, as if seeing her for the first time. In that moment, I felt a flicker of pity for her. She was a victim of this too, in her own way. I turned back to the Duke. "I am not fragile," I said, my voice ringing with a conviction that came from the very core of my being. "I am not mad, and I'm not afraid of you anymore," I finished, my last words directed at the crumbling facade of Lady Beatrice. The Duke, Alaric, stepped forward, coming to stand beside me. He did not touch me, but his proximity was a shield, an unbreachable wall. He looked down at my stepmother, his face a mask of cold contempt. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice like the crack of a glacier, "you will restore every penny you have stolen from your stepdaughter's trust. You will make a full public apology for the slanders you have spread, and then you will remove yourself from society. If you fail to do any of these things, Mr. Davies will see that you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. You have preyed upon the defenseless for the last time." He turned to my father. "As for you, Lord Ashworth, you will find your invitations to my homes and to any event I host are permanently rescinded. You will make your own way home. My carriage is waiting for Eleonora." Beatrice made a choked, sputtering sound, her face a ruin of hate and disbelief. My father seemed to age a decade before my eyes. Rosalind, to her credit, rose and came to my side. "I'm so sorry, Eleonora," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I never knew. I never saw." I simply nodded, accepting the apology for what it was, too little and far too late. Alaric placed a hand lightly on the small of my back, a gesture of both possession and protection. "Come, Eleonora," he said softly. "Let us leave this place." And together we walked out of the room, leaving the wreckage of my old life behind us. He led me not to the waiting carriage, but through a set of French doors onto a stone terrace overlooking the vast windswept gardens. The storm of the confrontation had passed, leaving a strange, hollow quiet in its wake. The air was cold and clean, and it felt like the first breath I had taken in years. I walked to the balustrade, my hands gripping the cold stone, and stared out at the gray, brooding sky. I felt empty, vindicated, but empty. The battle was over, but I did not yet know what peace felt like. Alaric came to stand beside me, the silence between us comfortable, patient. He did not press me to speak. He simply waited, giving me the space to find my footing in this new, unfamiliar world where I was no longer a victim. "She will not trouble you again," he said finally, his voice a low assurance. "I know," I replied, my own voice sounding distant to my ears. "It is just, for so long, my life was defined by her, by avoiding her anger, by enduring her cruelty. Now that it is gone, I'm not entirely sure who I'm supposed to be." "You are Eleonora Ashworth," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "You are the woman who understands the social implications of Roman aqueducts. You are the woman who knows that windows in a library should face east. You are the woman who sat in silence with a grieving man and offered not pity, but companionship. You were never defined by her. She was merely a shadow that fell across you. The sun has come out now." I turned to look at him then, truly look at him. The severity of his features was softened by an expression of profound tenderness. The winter in his eyes had thawed, replaced by a warmth that was directed entirely at me. "Alaric," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "Why? Why have you done all this for me?" He took a step closer, his tall frame shielding me from the wind. He gently took my hands in his grip warm and steady. "When Annalise died," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "the world lost its color. It became a gray, silent place. For years I walked through it as a ghost. I built walls around myself, not to keep others out, but to contain my own emptiness." His gaze was so intense, it was almost painful to meet. "And then I saw you. In that ballroom, you were living in a gray world of your own, one that had been forced upon you. But I did not see a ghost. I saw a vibrant, brilliant mind trapped in the shadows. I saw a strength you did not even know you possessed. I did not move my chair to rescue you, Eleonora. I moved it because I was drawn to your light. You brought the color back into my world." He lifted one of my hands and brushed his lips against my knuckles, a gesture of such reverence it made my heart ache. "What I have done," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine, "I have done for myself, because a life without you in it has once again become unthinkable." He released my hand and reached into his coat, pulling out a small velvet box. My breath caught in my throat. He did not kneel. That would have been too conventional, too much a part of the world we were both rejecting. Instead, he stood before me, his equal, and opened the box. Inside, a single clear diamond rested on a bed of black velvet. It was not a large, ostentatious stone, but one of perfect, understated clarity, a captured piece of starlight. "I am not asking you to be my duchess," he said, his voice thick with a vulnerability I had never heard before. "I am not offering you a title or a rescue from your past. I'm asking you to be my partner, to fill the halls of this cold house with debate and laughter, to be the person I discuss books with late into the night, to be my friend, my confidant, my wife. I am asking you, Eleonora, to let me spend the rest of my life seeing you." Tears, so long suppressed, streamed freely down my face. But these were not the tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of catharsis, of a joy so profound it was painful. This was not a fairy tale proposal. It was something better. It was real. It was a meeting of two lonely souls who had found in each other a reason to live again. "Yes," I whispered, the word a rush of air, of life. "Yes, Alaric. Yes." A smile, a true transformative smile, broke across his face, erasing the last of the shadows. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto my finger. It was a perfect fit. And then he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of homecoming. It was the end of a very long winter and the promise of 1,000 springs. It tasted of relief and of hope and of finally, truly being seen. 1 year later, I stood on that same terrace, but everything was different. The autumn wind was still brisk, but I felt no chill. A heavy wool shawl, the color of a summer sky, was draped around my shoulders, and Alaric's arm was a warm, solid weight around my waist. The formal gardens below were no longer just a landscape to be viewed, but a place where we walked every evening, our footsteps in sync, our conversations weaving through the twilight. My father had written to me once, a short, stilted letter full of remorse. I had not replied. Some wounds could not be healed with mere words. Beatrice had disappeared from society, taking Rosalind with her to some remote corner of the country to live in quiet disgrace. I hoped, for Rosalind's sake, that she would find a life of her own, free from her mother's suffocating ambition. But they were figures from another lifetime, ghosts from a story that was no longer mine. My story was here, in this house that was no longer a fortress, but a home. The black crepe had been removed from the portraits, not to erase the memory of those who were lost, but to allow them to be a part of the life that now filled the halls. The east wing was no longer silent. It was where Alaric had his study, and I had my own, right across the hall, our doors always open, The library, our sanctuary, was the heart of our home, a place of constant discovery and shared passion. "What are you thinking about?" Alaric's voice was a low murmur against my hair. I leaned back against him, my head resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I was thinking about the color of invisibility," I said softly. "I used to think it was gray, the color of my old dress, of the walls I used to hide against." He was silent for a moment, his arm tightening around me. "And now?" I smiled, turning in his arms to face him. I looked into his dark, intelligent eyes, eyes that had seen me when no one else had bothered to look. "Now I know there is no such thing," I said. "There are only people who choose not to see." I reached up and traced the strong line of his jaw. "Thank you for being the one who chose to see me." He captured my hand, pressing a kiss into my palm before closing my fingers over it, as if to hold the warmth there. "Seeing you, Eleonora," he said, his voice full of a love that was as steady and enduring as the ancient stones of the manor around us, "was the first truly sensible thing I have done in a decade, and it is a choice I will make every day for the rest of our lives." He kissed me then, a slow, deep kiss under the vast open sky, and in his arms I was not plain or quiet or in the way. I was simply Eleonora. I was his duchess. I was his wife. I was visible. I was home.